story is such an epic story, from this being such a hot company to sort of its explosion.
And at the center of the explosion, the company's founder.
In 2003, then 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford and founded Theranos with the hope of using small amounts of blood, just a few drops, to do what normally took numerous tubes.
Her company reached a valuation of more than $9 billion.
Theranos was the darling of Silicon Valley and partnered with a massive pharmacy chain to provide on-site blood testing. Then came the massive red flags.
Just this morning, the Wall Street Journal ran a pretty scathing article about the company.
The company was actually doing the vast majority of its blood tests on commercial analyzers purchased from third parties.
Investigative reporter John Carreyrou's stories caught the eye of U.S. regulators and law enforcement.
Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes charged with massive fraud.
Charged with raising more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate years-long fraud.
Criminal charges may also be laid. Carreyrou has been investigating this story for the past 3.5 years now, and he's chronicled it all in his new book, Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. He joins us from New York City. So, John, let's go back a little ways to when this company was seen really as the darling of Silicon Valley. So was she. There was medical marvel behind it, people sort of, trying to race each other to invest in it. What brought you to bring a critical eye to it?
Right. Well, the first thing that put the company on my radar, even though Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos had been in the public eye and had reached fame arguably about 6 months or a year before I read it, but it was this New Yorker magazine article. And there were a couple of things in there that didn't sit well with me. One of them was this notion that a college dropout who had 2 semesters of chemical engineering under her belt had just dropped out and pioneered groundbreaking new science. Of course, I might not have done anything with it if I hadn't gotten a tip from a source about a month later.
And what was that tip in essence?
Right, this was a clinical pathologist in Missouri who moonlighted as the writer of this obscure blog called Pathology Blog. He'd seen the same New Yorker story. He knew obviously a thing or two about blood testing, and he posted a short blog item on his blog declaring himself a skeptic. And shortly thereafter, he was contacted by this little band of skeptics, one of whom had been involved in patent litigation against Holmes. And it also so happened that this person who had been in patent litigation against Holmes had just made contact with the laboratory director who had left the company and who was alleging all manner of wrongdoing. So the pathologist in Missouri relayed this to me and then put me in touch with these people, and eventually I pulled on this string and made contact with the just departed laboratory director, who was, by the way, terrified. Theranos was having him hounded by lawyers from the famous law firm Boyce Schiller Flexner, and would only agree to talk to me off the record and if I promised him confidentiality.
So if we fast forward a bit, you do these stories. What was the reaction? What level of pushback did you get?
I mean, it was unbelievable. It was like nothing I've ever experienced in my 20-plus year career as an investigative reporter. In June of 2015, David Boies and several of his associates came to our newsroom, the Wall Street Journal's newsroom in Midtown Manhattan, and sat down with us for a 5-hour meeting and put little tape recorders at both ends of the conference room table, and it was very clear that they were considering this essentially something of a deposition in a future legal proceeding. And they then, proceeded to take this really aggressive stance with us, which was that I had misappropriated Theranos trade secrets and that we must either destroy them or return them right away. And then from there, it just escalated. Very
briefly, there's a level of perseverance here required of a journalist when they are hit with pushback that comes from so many quarters. There was the legal pushback. There were people who had championed her on air, who were sticking by her. What's the takeaway for other journalists?
Well, for sure, the takeaway is persistence, and that if you're confident in your reporting, and you must do you're reporting rigorously and don't go with just one anonymous source, but corroborate with other sources, and which is what I spent a long time doing before publication. But once you feel like you've reached that critical mass, be confident, especially if you see pushback like I encountered from the company that isn't really marshaling any substantive arguments and is really only using threats and intimidation as a tactic. Stonewalling like that is usually a sign that you're on the right track.
John, looking forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.